Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the left Christian podcast that will give you the calling you need for your life. I'm Ben Molyneux-Headington and I'm joined by Adam Spears. Say hi, Adam.
Hello, hello.
And I am joined for his third appearance on the podcast by Damon Garcia, friend of the show, YouTuber, online presence, and most importantly for this, now two-time author. We're going to be talking about his new book today. So welcome aboard, Damon. It's lovely to have you back.
Hello, hello. Yeah, thank you for having me.
I totally forgot that you've been on 2 times before.
I was thinking it was my second.
Yeah,
but no, because you did a Christmas episode for us and the one for your last book. I'd completely forgotten.
And I know that because I went through our back catalogue to find how many episodes you've done, because I had a moment of, is it 1 or is it 2? So that we're all on the ball here. But
it's definitely been a while. And I'm glad to be back.
I was blown away by the fact the episode we did for your last book was in 2022, which on one level makes sense because you've written another book since then. So that it wouldn't have been that recent, but also couldn't believe how long ago it was that we last had you on. But it is fantastic to have you back.
Yeah, I was looking through a bunch of the podcasts that I went on during the first book, and a bunch of those podcasts aren't doing it anymore. So I commend y'all.
That makes us, like, in some way, victorious.
Better than everybody. So just better.
Given that it has been 4 years since we last had you on, and hopefully we might have accrued 1 or 2 new listeners in the meantime. For anyone who doesn't
lost a few.
Don't care about them. They've fallen by the wayside. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, to any listeners who haven't come across you before?
Yeah, my name's Damon Garcia. I'm a writer, a creator. I make videos and articles pretty much about spirituality and society from a Christian leftist perspective. And I put out a book in 2022 called The God Who Riots, Taking Back the Radical Jesus. That one was, very much about looking at Jesus as more of an activist and looking at the historical context where he's in. And I'm still passionate about getting people to see that side of Jesus. And then for this book, I wanted to go a bit broader and a bit deeper and talk about calling and purpose and get people to stretch their perspective of calling and purpose beyond this conservative Christianity and capitalist version of calling and purpose. And so there's still Jesus in there. There's quite a bit of Jesus in it. But now I feel like the Jesus stuff is in there because it's part of me, not necessarily because the book is about that. But I feel like these days I like being able to talk about this stuff for anyone, like not just Christians, but people who at least are open to like the radical Jesus and want to talk about purpose beyond the capitalist idea of it. And so, I just put out this book, You Don't Need a Calling, an anti-capitalist manifesto for a life of purpose. And I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, and not to plug the wrong book, but God Who Riots, I was obviously thinking about it earlier today, thinking about you coming on, and obviously having read the second book. And actually, I suddenly realised that a lot of books I read and find interesting and, then kind of ask me in a year's time and I won't be telling anything about it, particularly non-fiction. I'm really bad for it just kind of slipping off. But I distinctly recall 2 things about it that are still kind of actually gnawing away on my brain. One was you talking about, was it Minneapolis where the police station burnt, and you kind of drawing the parallels between that and Pentecost, but also the bit where you made the point that I think I'm probably still kind of working through a little bit that Jesus was guilty by the laws of his time and was kind of rightfully put to death. So I think that is a little bit late, but one of the best reviews I can give you is there are ideas in that first book that are still worming their way around my brain and I'm still kind of unpicking the significance of. And I am sure that when we come and talk about your third book, if I'm allowed to say that, we'll be talking about the things that still worm their way around my brain from this one as well. So really excited to chat to you about this today.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be awesome. Appreciate it.
I think The God Who Riots was also on Chris Howson's list of books of the year when we did like the end of year podcast for that year. So yeah, it's I definitely if people who are listening haven't read it, I definitely recommend going and reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. We will talk about the right book soon enough, because we are here to talk about your new book, You Do Not Need a Calling. But before we get onto that, we will start, as we always start, with what else is on my mind grapes.
What else is on my mind grapes?
And Adam, you sent me through something that was on your mind grapes. We are recording this a few days after the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And there was some interesting stuff around the potential shooter the accused shooter, I should say, that have emerged on that you wanted to talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that one of the first things that Trump and his lot said about this person was that he was anti-Christian. And as it turns out, this guy is described as clearly identifying himself as Christian, which I think is really interesting. I think it's also one of those things where one of the difficulties with the way this kind of thing happens is that for a long time, the left has kind of been saying most acts of terrorism and political violence and that kind of thing are actually perpetrated by the right, which is true. But obviously, we're seeing this is potentially a bit more left-coded, and maybe some of the other attempts are a bit more left-coded. The whole Luigi Mangione thing is potentially more left-coded as well. I don't want to get too much into the weeds of their exact kind of beliefs, but there's that. There's also, as I say, this thing about Christianity as well, which I think, leads us into a potentially, I don't know, interesting, if that's the right word, discussion about Christianity's relationship with violence in the face of a far right, arguably fascist government and leader. I don't have any particular answers to any of that, but I do think that's interesting, and also those parallels between kind of what we like to say about the left and political violence and Christianity and political violence, arguably.
Yeah, it was really fascinating how the story very quickly came out that this guy was a committed Christian, and as you say, there was this. It was painted as this was an anti-Christian thing in the immediate aftermath, and I guess it does complicate that story, because I have to admit I was surprised when this guy turned out to be a kind of practicing Christian of some description. But I guess there's kind of a reminder of that Christian identity is much less clean, very, very multifaceted. To be a Christian is a very kind of complicated thing, and there are multiple ways of being that. But it's I guess found it surprising when it kind of emerged that this was someone who was kind of quite publicly and openly a professing Christian.
When you read something, and we always identify with the good guy, don't we? Right? Even if maybe we shouldn't. And actually, as I was reading this, the more I was reading about him, I was kind of identifying with him, and then I was like, hang on, this is bringing up all kinds of complicated ideas about what's good and what's valid and what's, what kind of violence is legitimate and who gets to wield it, and whether kind of an assassination of a political leader is ever justified and all of that kind of thing. But I thought to myself, I wouldn't do this, and I don't think I would support this. But in another life, I think I could have, Yeah, it's
interesting. I kind of see what you're saying. It feels more complicated. Obviously, Damon, you are in fact in the States, so without getting yourself in any legal trouble, because that's very important.
Yeah. How many assassination attempts have you made on the president's life?
But I guess, yeah, what is your kind of view on this, and how does that track with your kind of understanding of how Christian identity plays out over there?
Yeah, it's interesting. It doesn't really work when people are like, oh, they did this thing, that means they're not Christian. Christianity has become so diverse. It's always has been that Christianity plays out in all kinds of ways. Or I like Dean Detloff from the Magnificast refers to Christianity as a kind of technology. So it's like technology could be used in all kinds of different ways. And so, and then as for the violence, it's interesting you said how you could see yourself in another life. I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that when someone does commit these kinds of acts of violence, it's too easy to just dismiss it as like, oh, that's just a crazy person or something like that. And people are able to recognize the material conditions that lead someone to actually want to do these things. And they could see themselves in a kind of position like that if their situation was just slightly different, not even totally different, but slightly different. They could see themselves in that kind of situation. And also speaking of The God Who Riots, I was my friend was doing a book club for the book in a town a few hours away, and he had me visit for their last meeting, and I was interested to see what they thought and some of the questions they had. And pretty much every question they had something to do with violence and nonviolence. And they wanted to talk. It was they're all part of a mainline Protestant progressive church, but they wanted to talk about Luigi Mangione. They wanted to talk about Hamas and resistance to colonialism, and like, when is it okay? When is it not okay? And even the idea of if crime and law, how that can't exactly just determine what's right or wrong, because there's a lot of things that are legal that are wrong and things that are right that are made illegal. And so I just thought it was interesting that it felt like they never actually get to have a more deeper, nuanced conversation about violence, especially in certain progressive Christian circles that talk a lot about being nonviolent, always nonviolent. But then if you bring up certain situations, such as resistance against colonialism, that they will ease up a bit, but then and be like, oh yeah, of course that's okay in that situation. But then next Sunday comes around and they say, no, violence is always wrong from the pulpit. And it's I just think, yeah, a lot of people are starting to wake up and wanting to have a deeper conversation about these things.
I think it's interesting as well that you sort of mention how, some things are, illegal that shouldn't be illegal, and some things illegal that, because I've been listening or watching today because I live a very, very sad life. The Home Office is the government's appeal against the High Court's ruling that the ban on Palestine action was illegal. So their appeal is today and tomorrow. And it's unusually for a UK court, it's being live streamed. And also there are things in place that mean that we can't say certain things about the case. Otherwise, like if someone hears this, we'll get in trouble, be in contempt of court. But one of the things I sort of observe is that in this country, we are experiencing successive governments at this point who are getting more and more restrictive, more and more authoritarian on protest and direct action and peaceful protest and peaceful direct action, and labeling things terrorism that just blatantly aren't terrorism. That I think they're sleepwalking themselves and the country into a situation where I don't think the response to that is going to be less violence. It's going to be more violence, and it's going to be more potent forms of violence, potentially against the person rather than against property, which they've decided also counts as both violence and terrorism, which is insanity to me. So yeah, that's just something that I've been kind of thinking about a lot today as well, to get in there for a sort of slight additional mind grapes there.
Yeah, I think violence is far more complicated than it's often discussed, right? And I think it is interesting that the questions about violence came out of your God Who Writes book, because there is it's maybe not the main theme, but you are inevitably tackling questions of violence when you're talking about rioting, right? And the complexity of it. And we can sit here and say, well, I don't believe in violence, while we record on computers that only exist because forms of violence and oppression have taken place, right? For me to claim to not be violent, it only makes sense if I ignore the broader implications of my choices and actions, right? I'm not an anarcho-primitivist. I'm not saying we have to, go back and make everything ourselves and all the rest of it.
Return to monkey.
yeah. But yeah, it's quite a more complicated question than violence, yes or no, right? There's you have to kind of treat it, and it's interesting to hear that people are kind of trying to grapple with questions of violence and what violence looks like and when it is justifiable, I guess.
It's also interesting that from a legal perspective in this country, at least, it's not possible for the state to be violent and to act as a terrorist. And I always just find that legal distinction absolutely incredible, because it's very convenient for them, isn't it?
Yeah, this is funny. You see all the time, political pundits trying to say the other side is starting to make things violent. And it's it's been violent, so violent.
Yeah, absolutely. We could probably spend the rest of the podcast talking about violence and its things, and it'd be really interesting, but then you'd probably be in trouble for not promoting the book more. So I will move us on.
Well, I'll say it is deeper than, violence, yes or no, or are you personally doing physical violence, like you said, with computers and everything. And it was interesting when I was part of that book club meeting and they're asking about violence, and I was surprised because I felt like I wasn't directly talking about it as much in that book. And then I was talking a bit about this next book, and somebody said, are you going to talk more? Are you going to talk about violence and things and systemic violence like you did in the first book? And I was thinking, I don't think I talked about it that much in the first book, but if you're able to see it at that deeper level, then yeah, that's in the second book too. And we're talking systemic violence and how all these things are interconnected and provide a life for people, and imperialism and all that. Yeah, that's all connected for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk then. Let's turn to talking about your new book, You Don't Need a Calling, an anti-capitalist manifesto for a life of purpose, which is a really excellent book. We have both read it and greatly enjoyed it. And I guess I'm interested in, you kind of mentioned this before about kind of your first book was a very explicitly kind of directly Christian book. This book obviously has kind of quite a lot of Christian themes in, and you're doing some theology in there, but it's not in and of itself a kind of work of theology necessarily, or work of kind of Christian. And it almost, I don't want this to come across as an insult, but it is kind of almost a self-help book, right? And I'm really fascinated. And by the way, it's very good, so don't let that put you off.
Right.
But I'm fascinated by your decision to kind of write something that, if you had to categorize it, would be in that genre.
Yeah, you're right. Well, I feel like it's kind of disguised as a self-help book intentionally. And I feel like I'm trying to, I mean, really the similarities with the self-help book is that I feel like we're addressing some of the same issues, which is this feeling of being not good enough, or lack of purpose and lack of direction in life. And a lot of these self-help books would be like, well, you just need to work harder on yourself, and you just need to think of yourself more positively. And it's always ends up just being a giant mirror that it reflects back to the reader that you just need to work on yourself. But I'm being like, okay, yeah, let's talk about those issues. but let's see it from a bigger perspective and recognize the economic forces that shape our lives that cause us to feel so often like we're not good enough. And when I first started writing the book, it was more spiritual and personal. And as I kept writing, I realized if I want to be honest, I have to talk about capitalism. Like it otherwise it's not honest. Otherwise it's just like surfacey or kind of manipulative in the way that a lot of self-help books are. And it's like we have to talk about capital, especially when people talk about what they want to do with their life, how they want to spend their energy day to day. That there's all these barriers in the way because of capitalism that we have to confine our dreams and goals to. And so part of it was me wanting to just write an honest book addressing those things that self-help books usually do. But also I wanted to write for the people who are tired of reading these books and hearing these podcasts that say you can't change the world unless you change yourself first, or the Jordan Peterson, make your bed before you criticize the world. This book is for people who recognize you can do two things at once, and changing yourself and changing the world are interconnected. It's not one or the other. And so, yeah, it's all connected.
I was very tempted to play the heresy button when you just at the mention of Jordan Peterson at that point, but you were in full flow. But just to be clear, Jordan Peterson, heretic, official line of the podcast.
I thought it was really there was a bit in it relatively later on in the book where you kind of went through and kind of outlined a bit of that kind of a Marxist theory of alienation, and something just clicked for me, and I was like, actually, that's exactly, if you're going to write a genuine self-help book, how are you going to do it without saying, actually, it's not just that you're a crap person who's not following the 5 steps to a happier life. It is that the economic system we live in is making you feel bad. And there's almost an honesty there of like, these are some things that can help, but do you know what? I can't solve everything for you because you're still going to live in a capitalist system. And it felt like that was the moment for me, the really book kind of clicked in terms of almost this 2-track thing of, yes, there are things we can do, we need to think about things differently, but also we have to be honest about the reality of what capitalism does to us on an individual level.
Yeah, none of these self-help books are talking about the Marxist theory of alienation. So it's like, yeah, we got to talk about that and recognizing, and also it's interesting because Karl Marx, that was part of the early Karl Marx of talking about how it affects people internally and that alienation we feel, and kind of a more moral perspective of like it's dehumanizing, it's internally alienating, and that isn't right. And so we should fight against a system that causes that. And then later he tried to get more scientific and get out of the moral argument and the humanist argument. But as we've seen, there's a lot of theorists that have tried to recover that early Marx and show that, well, there is something there, because a lot of people first wake up to the injustice of the system by recognizing our internal alienation, that something is off. Why can't I ever feel good enough no matter how much I do? Also, why can't I talk to my coworkers about how much they make without getting in trouble? Also, why can't we have better treatment without risking losing our job? And it's like it commonly starts there, and then people start to notice the alienation in the whole system. And so I think there's a lot of people. It's interesting. People will talk about, it's like in the United States, people will look at all the people who voted for Trump and say like, oh, wow, I can't believe so many people are so right wing and fascist and stuff like that. And then you talk to them and they talk about how like they really just want things to be more affordable, and they're tired of being pushed around by the elites. And that you realize like, oh, they actually really care about working class issues, but they've just been manipulated by certain politicians and told, oh, we'll solve that for you by getting rid of immigrants. And they're like, well, at least they're offering a solution. The Democrats aren't saying anything, aren't giving us anything. And so I think there's a lot of people who are willing to have these conversations and open to recognizing what ties all working class people together. But there's just so much manipulation out there that has caused people to not realize that there actually is a larger issue that unites us all that we could be talking about if we weren't just following the manipulation of these politicians that try to get us to just blame each other for all our problems.
Yeah, and I think sort of going back slightly to the point about, you know, early Marx and alienation and that kind of thing. I think, you know, reading this, for me personally, it you know, it's come at an important time, you know, because my life has gone a different route to what I expected and to what I planned for it. In a way, you know, I guess in some ways not dissimilar to what you described for yourself in the book. But I remember as I was sort of gradually losing my, you know, I was about a year and a half into training for ordained ministry, got to April, had a meeting with a staff member who shall remain unnamed. And I knew from that meeting, I came back to my flat and my partner was visiting, and I just said to her, they're going to kick me out. I absolutely knew from that point, they're going to kick me out. And for the year and a half that I've been there, I'd been trying to kind of deal with systems and structures and difficulties whilst being ill in various ways and not being able to meet those requirements and so on. And all of the solutions that were kind of thrown my way felt so shallow because they didn't have that Marxist kind of analysis, because they were just kind of trying to point to, you know, almost me being the one who was wrong or in the wrong or doing something wrong or just unlucky even, which, you know, is, you know, there is a lack of luck there, I suppose, in a sense. And, you know, I'm not ever the kind of person who would never want to accept any, you know, to think, oh, well, I could have done something different. I'm sure that's true. But actually, ultimately, all of that was bollocks, you know? And it was just that people, I think, couldn't grasp the idea that there was a deeper issue there because they hadn't read their Marx. They hadn't dealt with ideas of alienation or anything like that. And so for me, just to make it all about myself, you know, this book has felt almost like a vindication, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people aren't willing to look at it from that larger perspective because people usually find the systemic perspective disempowering personally. Because if we're saying, well, there's a larger system at play, a lot of people, their thought process is, oh, so you're saying I can't do anything then, and there's nothing to do then. It's just that way from the system. And so from that disempowering feeling, they prefer the individualist critique and perspective to be like, oh no, actually it's your fault and your responsibility alone. Then that gives you something to do. It's like, okay, I can do something now. But I think it's too binary of a way of approaching it. And it's like, a systemic analysis doesn't have to be disempowering. It just means that it's deeper, that it's going to involve more people than just you to solve this thing. And this isn't going to be solved by some lone brave hero. It's going to be a systemic solution to systemic problems. And so I think, I wish, I think there's also a lot of people who would have a more systemic analysis of things if it weren't so scary at first for some people.
I think that's actually a really good point because I remember as I was going through this whole thing, getting about a third of a way through a book about disability in the UK. And it sent me into a spiral of despair because it was too close to home, and I never finished that book, even though it was, from what I read, completely right.
I did think of you, Adam, actually, as I was reading the book, the section or the chapter really, where you kind of talk about how you felt called, Damon, and maybe unpacking that call. And actually, I was reading it and thinking to myself, damn, this is something that, even if the specifics are different, like I feel like both Adam and I are absolutely going to go, oh yeah, I get that on a quite deep level. And you do this really interesting thing where you tell a bit of the story, you kind of tell the, I guess, simple kind of evangelical Christian version of the story to begin with. Where you say, I felt this calling, the calling was affirmed, I followed the calling. And then things kind of don't work out that way for various reasons. And you talk about this idea of reading scripture as being like turning the gem. And so you kind of turn the gem a bit on, and you talk about scripture as well, but on that story and, approach it from different angles. And that kind of works really nicely. And then there's this really interesting bit where you say, but just because I've replaced the old narrative with the new narrative doesn't mean that's the whole story. And I was like, yeah, because I think there's something so important about, I had a sense that I was called for something, right? I remember vividly being at a Christian camp and having someone, we've talked about this on the podcast before, someone who is now reasonably well known in UK Christianity, kind of...
Name them, Ben. Name them. I can bleep it if I need to.
I can't remember their name. That's the only reason. It's the Youth for Christ guy who's now somewhere else. We talked about it in the episode, but can't remember the knife for me, his name. But anyway, he Gav Calver, there you go. There.
Oh, he's Evangelical Alliance guy. Yeah.
So anyway, he was obviously more junior at this point, doing some youth in at this thing, and prayed that I would be some sort of Christian leader or whatever. And
how's that going?
Yeah, brilliantly. That's how I see this podcast. Is that not? But actually, there's I had a time of believing that, time of wrestling with that, a time of completely rejecting that. And now I kind of look and say, well, like, there is a more complex version of that story. And I really liked that you didn't just go, calling us stupid, forget about, like, it wasn't as simple as that, but saying, okay, we can accept that things weren't as simple as that, but there was still a multiplicity of narratives that you can talk about, right? And yeah, I found that really quite a compelling way of approaching things that kind of avoided replacing one simple narrative with another simple narrative.
Yeah, I'm really glad you resonated with that. I was a little worried when writing that whole chapter because it gets really deep into my personal story, and I was hoping readers wouldn't be like, okay, when are we going to get to the anti-capitalism part? Am I reading about this guy's personal? What I was hoping for is exactly what you said, that you would see yourself in this story and relate it to what you've been through. And yeah, the thing that I write really briefly in the book, but I always think about is the idea of finding an explanation for your story, and how the word explanation and explain literally means to make plain, like flattening out a field. It's just to make it plain, flat, and this is what the story is. But that's flattening out the wilderness. And in reality, it's so much more weird and wild and unpredictable. And so, yeah, my story, I talk about in the second chapter, who's the director. I say, yeah, I have this calling story that I would tell people for years that I now consider the naive version of the story, and I have multiple versions of it now. But that first version of the story, the way I experienced it, was I was at a youth camp that right after I graduated high school is my last youth camp. And they said, the pastor from the stage said to ask God what he has called you to do. And at the time I was just into music and film and felt like that's where my life was going to go. Either both of those or one of those. And so I said, might as well as my last youth camp. And I asked God, what am I to do? And I felt like I heard pastor, and that didn't make any sense. So I just ignored it. And then a few months later, there was this woman I was talking to who was a part of the this internship at her church for ministry training, and we had a little relationship, and she was telling me she had this dream and this vision from God, and I was in it, and I looked like a pastor or something. I was preaching this large group of people, and I was terrified because I felt like it was God communicating through her, saying, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to get someone to say the same exact thing. And I then was like, confessed to her very nervously, yeah, I think God called me to be a pastor. And then she was super excited and encouraged me to join that program that she was in. But I was like, I need a clear, direct answer from God, though, if I'm going to do a huge step like this. And then I prayed and prayed and prayed one night. I heard nothing. I was texting her and frustrated. I'm hearing nothing. Went to sleep, hoped for a dream, woke up, nothing. And I didn't know what to do. And then I got a text from this 20-something-year-old pastor from LA that I met once. And he said, hey, God's been telling me to pray for you all week long, and I have no idea why. So what's going on with you? And I said, and then I just told him everything. And then he encouraged me, and he called me, and we're talking it out. And he said, sometimes God's not going to tell us everything. Sometimes you just got to take a leap of faith. And I think it would be good for you to join this program. And so I felt like that moment is like, oh my God, God is so powerful, supernatural. God communicated supernaturally through these people. And that started my whole ministry journey. I went to that program 2 years, graduated, did a little bit of Bible college, became a youth and young adults minister for a while, ended up evolving theologically and disagreeing with my denomination on a lot of things. So before I got my pastoral license, I ended up leaving in 2017, started a YouTube channel where I could be honest about the things I believe. That led to me writing The God Who Riots and being able to make videos and go on podcasts like Bread and Rosaries and talk about these things. And then I wrote another book. And then I actually, a little bit before I'd written that first book, I was starting to think differently about my journey because it seemed like this isn't really me becoming a pastor. Kind of like it's funny, Ben, where you're like, he said I was supposed to be a Christian leader. It doesn't look like it. But then it's also like, but you're also the co-host of Bread and Rosaries. Like,
you can't get higher than that in the kind of Christian pastor world, can you really?
Right. But it's like you would have to change your definition of like pastor or Christian leader if you want to include that. And so I was wondering, do I just need to like reframe, like maybe this is just what God meant, or do I need to like reconsider some things about that old story? And I started to remember some details that I'd suppressed. One big detail was that woman that I was talking to, and we had sort of a relationship. I met her when I was a 16-year-old teenager in youth group, and she was an adult youth leader. And she started a romantic relationship with me and was grooming me. When the other youth leaders found out, they didn't do anything about it. They just told us to stop talking, and we just kept secretly emailing. And at the time, I didn't see anything wrong with it as a teenager because I was ignorant, naive kid who thought I was mature because people around me told me I was mature. So it made sense to me. And then when I became an adult, and especially when I became a youth leader myself and saw the relationship with youth leaders and youth, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe they let that fly. This is completely wrong. And then I, over time, started to think more about that story and realized, oh yeah, I forgot. She had always said that she always wanted to marry a pastor. And then she has this dream of me being a pastor. Also, that guy that texted me saying, God's been telling me to pray for you all week long, that was her friend. And I met him through her. And I was texting her that night. So she texted him, and he made up this story that God's been telling me to pray for you. And so looking back, I realize, oh yeah, also when I was at youth camp and thought I heard God say pastor, of course I thought I heard that because it was a pastor on stage. And that seemed like a really highly revered, respectable position. But even then I wasn't sure if I heard anything. And then I just started to realize, oh yeah, actually my origin story of this whole journey I've been on is corrupted. And I think it's like I was actually just manipulated into this. It wasn't this cool supernatural testimony that I thought I had. And for a while, I just kept it hidden, like in this little box in my head. And I felt like if I ever opened it, it would just destroy my faith. And over time, I just slowly started to tell some people in my life this other version of the story. And then I think the obvious question that I had and the other people would have is, well, if this was all just manipulation from the beginning, does that mean that everything you've been through since then was pointless? It was just a waste? And I think that's a weird way to view life. And I realized, okay, I have this naive version of the story of like, okay, there was God supernaturally communicating to me. And then I have this critical version of the story where it's like, okay, no, I was just manipulated by these predatory church leaders. And that is still like too flat of an explanation. And I started to think about it like that. There's that rabbinic term of turning the gem when you're reading the scripture, of the way you turn the gem in the light and see it from a different angle and see new colors and shapes. The point is to keep turning the gem, not to turn it until you get to the correct interpretation, which is so cool about like rabbinic interpretations of the Bible and midrash and all of that. And I think, and so I kept considering, okay, maybe there's more to this story. And through my own theological evolution, I started to see God less as this supernatural being in some other realm with history written out and we're just playing along, and more like God is here with us in real time, experiencing all of this with us in real time. And there are these moments all the time where God lures us toward more love, more beauty, more justice. And we could choose to respond to that lure, to that call, or not. And then there will be another lure, another call, another one, and another one, another one. And now I see it as like, I could have just went the route of doing music and film like I thought I would do, and God would have been a part of that. Instead, I went and did this ministry stuff, which always felt creative from the very beginning. So it wasn't too far off from what I was passionate about since I was a kid. And God was a part of that. And I could have done something else and God would have been part of that. And then tomorrow I could decide to do something completely different and God will be part of that. And there are all these small, simple callings I now recognize all around us, instead of this one singular high and holy calling that I better figure out or else I'm being disobedient. And I think now I'm able to see the story with a much bigger perspective, and understand that there was some manipulation in there, and also a lot of authentic growth and devotion to this faith and God and ministry and all this. And I was getting better at what I do over time, not just because, well, clearly God has called you to this, so God gave you these gifts, but also because I had a support system around me of people saying, including you two at Bread and Rosaries, telling me that this book is great, you're doing great. And that encourages me to keep going and write more. And that all matters too. And so that, and I know other people who didn't have that kind of support system I have, who've had similar callings and aren't doing ministry. Like that program I went to for 2 years back then for ministry training, I was the black sheep in that program because I was reading the books you're not supposed to read. They would give me these textbooks of like, here's one wrong perspective, here's another wrong, here's another heretical perspective, and here's the right one. But those parent wrong perspectives gave me something to research, and often they made more sense. And so I was always challenging things and thinking differently. And the rest of the people in my program were more aligned with what they were wanting to teach them and how they wanted them to grow. And I'm the only one still doing some version of ministry. They all went and just got other jobs and did other stuff, but it's one could look at it from the angle of, oh, well, I guess God only called you. Or it's just that I had a different support system. I had different conditions in my life that led to me still doing this thing and them doing something else. It's like, and that was like a big point I wanted to make with the book too, is people feel like, oh, I guess the people who made it, and it's kind of that Protestant work ethic, like it's the people who made it, it must be because God is favors them. And it's like, actually, there's so much more to that. And a lot of it has to do with our material conditions.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was reading that part of it where you sort of started talking about how you started to reconsider that kind of origin story, as you put it. And you say, well, the obvious question, is about the nature of your calling, what that means and all the rest of it. And that wasn't the first question I had when I was reading it. The first question I had when I was reading it is, so is she in prison then? And I assume she's not. And I say that as someone who's a prison abolitionist, but there's so often a lack of accountability for that. And I think at this point we can just sort of assume that all youth leaders and pastors in their 20s are predators and should be treated as such.
Can we please clarify that we mean Christian ones, just because some of us were secular youth workers in our 20s?
No, I'm trying to make sure that we've got everyone covered here, Ben. So, until I'm afraid this is a you're guilty till proven innocent kind of case rather than the opposite.
Well, I think a big problem, I don't know how it is in the UK, but especially in the US, there's so much less restrictions and requirements of people who work with kids and teenagers in the church. And it's like there's more requirements to minister to the adults than there is to kids, which it should be, I think, the reverse. Because, so many people have these stories of being in kids' church and hearing traumatizing versions of the Bible. And then you grow up and realize like, oh, they just got volunteers to go in there that like just barely read the Bible themselves. And they're just trying their best. And they're just thrown in there and they have no training, don't have any experience working with kids. And I was like, God caused the flood because he was angry. So don't be bad. and so it's like, but then if you want to preach on Sunday in front of the adults, it's like, oh, you have to be licensed, you have to be ordained, you have to have all of these things and theologically trained, all this stuff. And so I think that's part of the problem for sure, is that there's so much less requirements for people who work with kids in a lot of churches.
You are speaking my language as someone who has worked in kind of secular settings as with kids for pretty much my entire career. And actually, I don't know if it's the same over there, but over here there is this almost thing of like you're a youth pastor until you graduate to being an adult pastor sometimes.
It's the proving ground, isn't it? Is what it is. It's like children and young people are treated, that ministry is treated as a proving ground for the real ministry that happens with adults.
Yeah.
And it's mad because when you're a child and a young person, you are still like, as adults, it's a bit harder to traumatize them. It's a bit harder to indoctrinate them. It's, you've hopefully got a bit of experience. But with children and young people, you really would think that we'd be a bit more considerate of the fact that they're not developed yet. They are so much more impressionable
I mean, I think it's always crazy. I train people to work with kids now, and like, just the basic induction training for a lot of stuff. We're like talking about brain development. We're talking about, obviously we're doing like full safeguarding stuff. We are talking about therapeutic approaches to healing from trauma. Like, and I just think, man, how many of the youth pastors and like Christian youth workers I know had even a fraction of this knowledge. Like, and this is stuff that like in the field that I work in is like day one knowledge, right? Stuff we have to cover so you can even start like being in the same room as kids. It is, yeah, I think the expectations are shockingly low, sadly, at times.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about how you might be the only self-help book to include Marxist theory of alienation. You might also be the only quote-unquote self-help book to talk about the history of Satan. And I really wanted to talk about this because I thought we've had a few conversations, bits and bobs in passing over the last few episodes about heaven and hell, and we're going to delve into it a little bit more at some point in the future. But it is... I found it was really fascinating, almost this attempt to reclaim the idea of Satan, and a fantastic cameo from John Dominic Crossan in the mix as well. So tell us more about that, I guess.
Oh, yeah. The 7th chapter, second to last one toward the end, saved it for toward the end when I already hooked people in, as a chapter called The Enemy. And it's funny. I don't know how it is in other churches, but in Pentecostal churches, the enemy is like a very common name for the devil. Is like they would just say the enemy. Oh, that's the enemy. And I wanted the real purpose of that chapter is to get people to stop believing politicians and capitalists that say that each other is the enemy, or that marginalized people are the enemy, LGBTQ people and immigrants are the enemy, and realize that it's the capitalist system and the people who work on behalf of the capitalist system to continue to exploit us and divide us are the enemy. And it's and that's part of our purpose is to unite together and resist against that system. And I just thought it would be interesting to also talk about the devil. And that was the other thing. Early on, I felt like I got to talk about the devil somewhere, because growing up, thinking about purpose and calling and this idea of God has a plan for you and you got to figure it out, the opposite of that was the devil's plan for your life. And that if you're not following God's plan, then you're just deceived into following the devil's plan for you. And there was all that anxiety growing up. And so I was like, I have to talk about it somewhere in there. And I had this experience when after that first book, where I got an email from someone doing a book club through my book, and they said that they're doing it through Zoom. And they said, warning, we're a group of Satanists. And they said they're the San Diego chapter of this satanic temple. And but they were like, but don't worry, we're just spicy atheists. And it was funny because luckily I already had some knowledge of the satanic temple, which are usually mostly atheists, and most of them see Satan more as a symbol for rebellion against authoritarian Christians. It's like we have all these stories of Christian nationalists and fascist Christians who are trying to force these very authoritarian policies on all non-Christians and Christians too. And it's like I feel like there's a group of people who take on the symbol of Satan as a way of saying, okay, if you're going to say we're the enemy, then fine, we'll gladly be the enemy to you guys. And even though they don't literally believe in a literal Satan or worship Satan. And there are some that do, but specifically this Satanic Temple group, it was interesting because I went to that book club, and there were some of the nicest people I've ever met. They were like very nice, wholesome, normal people who just really liked that I was talking about the ways that people use Christianity to oppress others and how Jesus would have resisted against that. and he resisted against the ways that his own religion was corrupted in his day. And so they resonated with that Jesus. And it was just interesting because I grew up in an environment that said those people are the enemy for sure. And then realizing, oh, wait, we're actually on the same side. We're actually both fighting against a bigger systemic enemy of oppressive systems. And so that got me thinking about, okay, well, let's think about the history of Satan and realizing, a really good book on this is The Origin of Satan by Elaine Pagels. But when you look at when people started talking about Satan in the Old Testament, at first Satan is more of a role, like the angel who stands in front of Balaam in the road is it. And a lot of English translations won't use the word, but you'll see in the Hebrew it's Satan, STN, and then in Job. And then it's like an angel who isn't an enemy of God. It's just part of the court. And I forget the other passage. I think it's in Psalms. Again, it refers to someone, an angel as a role of a Satan, which is just like an opposer or someone who stands in the way. And then somewhere in the intertestamental period, they started talking about Satan as a symbol of a spiritual power that is controlling all these empires that are all controlling the same piece of land because of its resources. Babylon, Assyria, Greece, Rome. Instead of people seeing it as just separate empires that happen to be doing the same thing, they start to see a connection, a systemic evil between these empires, and they call it Satan. And I'm not exactly sure what they believed when they started saying Satan. And then you get to Jesus and the Pharisees calling each other Satan. I think for them, what what their insults toward each other was trying to communicate was that you're compromising with the system of the day instead of staying true and zealous to our God. And and so it's possible they were using it as more of a symbol. It's also possible that they later saw it as a spiritual being. I'm also open to the possibility that they had a genuine revelation of a real evil being named Satan. But I would say you could believe whatever you like about that. What I find interesting is the idea that Satan initially was a symbol for empire. And you see that all over Revelation too. And then after Christianity became the religion of the empire, Satan then became a symbol for anyone who resisted empire. And so then they started calling Jewish people satanic and pagans satanic and Christian heretics satanic. And then that goes through the Middle Ages. And then you get to like the satanic panic in the 80s. I don't know. I'm actually interested if what was going on in the UK during that time, but in the US, there was all these people who were having these supposed what is it called? The type of therapy where they're like recovering repressed memories, and some of these people were saying that they remember now that they were used to be in a satanic cult, and all these people were exposed for totally manipulating patients to make them believe that. And then there was a lot of conspiracy theories about preschools having being secretly satanic cults, and also music artists and heavy metal, and also later rappers being secretly satanic. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories about the left being satanic, LGBT people being satanic, and it still is used as a symbol for anyone resisting empire. And so I try to, like, in that part of the book, say, let's reclaim that symbol of Satan as a symbol of empire, and recognize, instead of trying to make each other satanic and demonic, recognize that we're actually all on the same side against a larger system of oppression. And then the John Dominic Crossan part is in there because I was talking about how part of why I was able to relate with this Satanist book club was because I am called satanic and demonic on the internet all the time and on basic things of like, gay people are cool. And then somebody's like, you're demonic. Or a classic one that I get sometimes is more like Damon Garcia. They'll comment that and think they're so clever, like they're the first person to say it. And then I met John Dominic Crossan, famous historical Jesus scholar, at this event called Theology Beer Camp. And we were in a room together, and I was talking to him, and he's iconic to me. And he's like 90 some years old. And he was asking me a little bit about what I do and how the response I get online. And then I said that, yeah, sometimes people will be like, more like Damon Garcia. And then he laughed and he said, yeah, back in the day, they used to call me John Demonic Crossan. And that was hilarious.
Such a good line. That's so much better than Damon Garcia, I've got to tell you. That's some creativity that's happened there.
Yeah, I mean, it was so cool because, and I felt like there was something healing about that moment, because I had friends in my life that I had told, yeah, sometimes they call me a demon on the internet, and they'd be like, oh, that's weird, or that's funny. And for the first time, I told someone that, and they said, me too. And that was like really healing to be like, oh yeah, this guy who's been doing this work since before I was born has the same story and is still going. And recognizing like a lot of those people who have that kind of accusation toward these kinds of progressive beliefs or anti-capitalist beliefs are often just projecting their own fears and insecurities.
Just for your interest, because you did ask the question. So we did have our own satanic panic over in the UK.
Oh, yeah.
But it was, so we have this thing where we love to just be a little bit behind, and just copy whatever you guys are up to. So we had our own mini satanic panic. The reason I know a little bit about it is there are a couple of cases of social services taking a child into care based on what turned out to be completely false allegations of kind of satanic cult abuse. So yeah, I think this was late 70s or 80s, something like that. It's kind of a
bit later, I think. Yeah,
maybe, but a known thing that not only did we have a version of that, but social services acted like it was real, even though it was a load of nonsense, which is actually very sad, really, when you think about it. But yeah, I thought it was really fascinating, you talking about not just saying, let's jettison this language of Satan and the devil and whatever else, but saying, actually, there's something productive, particularly in the history of it. And yeah, I felt like it was a really innovative use, I guess, of that idea of Satan in a way that made me go, oh, actually, the idea of a kind of a literal bloke with red horns is one that I left behind, but actually that language of satanic and of Satan and of enemy is still potentially useful in thinking about stuff now. Yeah,
I was worried too, putting that whole part about Satan in there, like even how you introduce this topic, it'd be like who else would put a whole section of the history of Satan in a self-help book, but also in this space of progressive Christian writers. I kept thinking Brad McLaren wouldn't have a section like this in a book. And I don't know if that means that I shouldn't. And I just kept thinking and I think the thing I was most worried about was that there are a lot of people who have trauma around the idea of Satan and still believe in Satan. Even some people have stories of they're staying at their grandma's house and they're a little kid and they felt something, they saw something, and you can't convince them otherwise. They saw something in the corner in the middle of the night, or other people in abusive situations where they felt like there was some evil spirit attached to what they were going through. And then other people who are just went deep into a bunch of YouTube rabbit holes and are super convinced that a satanic cult is behind everything. Yeah. Not the capitalists, but some satanic cult. and so I was worried of some people from all those different backgrounds getting to that part of the book and feeling like it is too much. and feel like they're doing something wrong and want to run away from it. And so I think like maybe a more responsible self-help author out there would take that whole part out just to be more accessible for the people out there. But I'm like, nah, I think this is part of my story, and I think this is really interesting, and the people who appreciate it, I think, will really appreciate it. So it's got to stay in there.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely really appreciated it. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Like, I genuinely think it's a really, like a good way of approaching those questions, and it was a kind of a way of approaching the question of opposing capitalism that almost only could have come from you, or at least from your perspective, right? Like, of bringing in that kind of, yes, I'm always saying the self-help story, but there's also that the Christian stuff there and the leftist stuff. Like, it felt like, I was reading that thinking, you were saying like, oh, Brian McLeod wouldn't write that. And I'm like, but you would. And that's what, like, like that's what makes it good, right? Like, it's that it is something you think, that's something that could only come out of your kind of interests and experience. It's, you don't want to write like everyone else is. No, I genuinely, it was, probably my favorite section of the book, because I was like, it did make me think about, like, actually, what is the value of talking about, like, Satan actually is that language of satanic, I guess, redeemable in some ways. It's not just looking at, a certain politician who's vaguely left of centre and screaming you're a Satan at them. But kind of a more useful thing for it. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I spent a long time also feeling like there's no point in this language, especially just seeing the way it was used growing up. And I think it was one of those things. I think a lot of us have these theological pinpoints where it just feels like I should explore that at some point, but later, not yet. And so for a long time, that's what the whole concept of Satan was for me, of like, I just isn't valuable for me right now, and it does more harm than good. I'll explore it later. I know there's something more there, but I'll explore it later. And then finally got around to it.
So, kind of right near the end of the book, you start talking about Ecclesiastes, which is, again, almost the opposite book of the Bible to what you think you'd go for. But I really identified with your story of, like, being a kind of a young person and reading Ecclesiastes, starting it and being like, what the hell is this then? And then kind of slowly, begrudgingly getting through it. And, it being presented to you very much as like, the ultimate message is trust God, everything's going to be fine. And then when you looked into it, you were like, well, that's actually a different narrative voice coming through there. I guess I'm interested to hear kind of what is it about Ecclesiastes that you felt was really kind of valuable in a book that at least has the clothing of a self-help book.
Yeah, in my NIV student Bible that I had back then, it says, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless, says the teacher. And at first I was like, this doesn't seem like it should be in the Bible. Like, this seems like the opposite of what they're trying to teach me at church. And I talked to my youth pastor, and he was like, just keep reading. And it just got worse. It was like, this is meaningless. Also, this is meaningless, and this is meaningless. But the bit of hope that I found in it, which I wasn't really able to understand until years later, because I kept coming back to that book, is that the other thing that the writer keeps repeating, besides everything is meaningless, is to go eat and drink and enjoy your work. And there is this consistent message that all we have is this, and we can enjoy it. And even like, which I think is real controversial, it says we all go to the same place as the animals after we die. It's like there's nothing else after this. And it's like, well, all we really have is this. And it's meaningless. The Hebrew word for that is havel, which means more like vapor. and impermanent. It's here one second, gone the next, or vanity in some other translations. And it's recognizing it's not that everything is just useless or something, or everything is negative. It's more like everything is impermanent. It's here one second, gone the next. So are we. And so all we can do is enjoy what we have while we're here. And it's interesting because I think that message is so powerful and so unlike everything else in the Bible. And then the curator of that text adds this little conclusion and says, but remember, follow God and be obedient to God. It's like it needs to add that little ribbon, because I think it's like that was a hard message for people to take in back then and today. And so it's like, but to be able nowadays to read that book, I just recognize that book as a message of grace. And for me, the more grace becomes more and more important in my life, depending on grace, unearned favor, as many preachers would define it, realizing that the more I believe in grace, the less I believe in calling. It's especially the idea of calling that you have to become some better version of yourself in order to be valuable or lovable or worthy of community. Realizing we already are valuable. All there is this, and all we can do is enjoy it. And there's nothing we can do to make ourselves earn this gift of life. And from that, living from that point, we can follow these small, simple callings and live with a purpose, but not so that we earn this life or earn God's love or other people's love or our own love, but rather living from that love. And so that's more how I see calling and purpose today, and kind of the freedom I found and what I'm trying to get people to have a shift toward too by reading this book.
It's interesting. Something we've talked a little bit about before is the idea that when you start being evangelical, particularly if you kind of become a leftist, you end up transferring your evangelical fervor just to like a different thing, and like all the things that I was like doing to kind of push evangelicalism, I kind of have the same impulses now related to kind of like leftist politics almost. And therefore, actually, I really found it quite, you saying everything is grace, you don't have to earn anything, you don't have to keep working. It does, I think it really made me stop and go, actually, in some ways, I still do live my life according to this idea of earning this stuff, of like having to respond to a higher calling, I guess. And it's just that my conception of that calling has changed. So I found it quite I guess challenging, but in a productive way, challenging section of the book.
Yeah, I'm still learning this stuff too. And even like in approaching the promotion of this book, I'm scheduling these podcast interviews and hoping that people see me as like worthy of being listened to and all that, but also like having to remember the book that I wrote and the messages of it, and I'm still learning it. And it was interesting too, that last chapter is called "Nothing is Wasted." And I had to put together a chapter outline for the publisher before I wrote the book and signed a contract and wrote it all out and stuff. And just like based on all the notes I had preparing to write the book and the previous chapters, what I know I wanted to talk about, it just felt like obviously this is leading toward me saying nothing is wasted. But like bodily, experientially, I don't think I really believe that. I don't live like I really believe that. I don't act like you ask me philosophically, I'll be like, oh, of course. But it just felt like this is the journey that this message is leading me toward for this book, but also for my life. And so I very much was learning the lessons of the book by writing the book. And it was so in a lot of ways, it was like me teaching this to myself and getting to a point where I can say everything is grace, nothing is wasted. And the book took me a whole lot longer than I thought it would to write, because I was still learning a lot of this stuff while writing it, and ultimately it ended up being great. It felt terrible during it, because it felt like I need to get this done. And then over time I was like, no, that I'm glad it took longer, because I was able to write more authentically and be more honest.
One of the things that I found interesting when it came to this chapter, Nothing is Wasted, is, you previously talked about a friend who had messaged a friend, I think it was a friend group chat, saying that they were going to take their own life, and that you jumped in the car and drove round to theirs, and and on the way trying to work out what on earth do you say or not say to someone who is in that kind of place, and that you watch lots of YouTube videos and so on. And it resonated with me when you sort of later on sort of say that you start this chapter by saying that it's your favorite book of the Bible, because I remember going through some really rough times when I was younger as well. And a lot of what people would say, it was meaningless, but in a different way, in a way that kind of didn't acknowledge the meaninglessness. And actually, it was Ecclesiastes, the acknowledgement of that meaninglessness, of the kind of futility of so much of life, seemingly, that resonated, because it was something that got where I was at, if that makes sense. And I think often you see people, they'll recommend things like Job. I think Job's a terrible book to recommend someone in that kind of situation, particularly because it's like, oh, Job's entire life, entire family is taken away from him. And it shows you kind of like how people and things and animals, but people were thought of in that culture, and to an extent today as well, because they're extensions of the main person, right? Like he owned them, they were his children, his animals, that never ever resonated with me, but I can see why Ecclesiastes is eventually kind of resonated with you. And I guess, I don't know, I guess what I find interesting about it is, like, you say at one point that it initially kind of terrified you. And I'm kind of really interested to dig deeper into that, because it's not, I kind of get it on a logical level, but it's not ever been my experience with that book.
Yeah. I think for some reason, I think there always was some bit of melancholy in my attitude throughout my whole life. And so I think that made me more open to things like Ecclesiastes and even Job, and more curious about that kind of thing. And so, or even like certain pessimistic philosophies, nihilist stuff like that, and absurdist stuff, and to be able to recognize that life is meaningless, but to be able to dive into it and be like, not as like the final word on life, but as kind of like opening up a new, more curious perspective on life. And so I was always kind of more open to that than my friends and stuff. But I think the reason why it always attracted me was because the messages of like just hope and false hope, it always just frustrated me of to be able to say like, oh, don't worry, God will fix it in the end, or you just have to pray harder and God will show you, or it's a mystery to you, but God has a plan, all that ultimately would always just be so frustrating, because it was just, it doesn't work out all the time. And to be able to be like, actually, at the foundation of life is a more wild, unpredictable chaos, resonates more. And to be able to be like, yeah, this is actually all chaos. And sometimes things kind of make sense, is like resonates way more than things always make sense. And sometimes they seem like they don't. And so and then part of what I get into the book too is then you look at Eastern philosophies, like certain schools of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and talking about life in a similar way, that everything is emptiness, or there is no individual meaning. But it's not bad news. It's not a pessimistic philosophy. It's good news. It's just how reality is. And I think what kind of blew my mind is that there's Western philosophers that have similar insights, but for them, it's terrible news. It's like, look how hopeless life is. And realizing that it's only from a Western point of view that the meaninglessness of life is bad news, because the Western point of view is rooted in colonialism, which is all about victory over the other, which then gets personalized as life is all about more and more victory over the other. And when you actually live life and don't experience that constant victory, it feels like, oh my God, life, there's no point to living life. Everything is meaningless. But when it's like, actually, no, this is just the real nature of life. It's not, you're not going to be winning your whole life. All there is this. It's like, oh wait, that's actually awesome. And that's the reality we're all sharing. And that's where I can find a bit of hope, is recognizing we're all experiencing this meaningless reality, and all we have is this and how we can enjoy it. And so that to me is like such better news.
One of the other things that you talk about in this chapter as well, and that I kind of want to get you to talk about a little bit, is the impact this has on prayer. So you talk a little bit about how your idea of prayer developed and changed, and you discovered different kinds of prayer. And I guess I wonder whether you could talk about like what does prayer look like now if we're kind of processing things in that way?
Yeah. And yeah, that kind of relates to what I was just saying, and the kind of messages I was told about hope that was always frustrating for me, is the messages about prayer of if you want something in your life, or for your life to get better, or something to be fixed, you just have to keep praying. And if it doesn't work, then you have to pray more and pray harder. I especially experienced that in this like Pentecostal charismatic church I had grown up in.
Like, pray until something happens, the wristbands and stuff. Remember that one?
I don't think I've seen that, but that
you
makes
remember
sense.
like the WWJD? There was also push.
Whoa! No, I never saw the push ones. That's
Yeah.
clever, though.
The best one was Frog, fully rely on God.
Never saw those. Oh my goodness, that's funny. Frog. Pray until something happens. Yeah, basically. And then I had a pastor at one point that said that what he always thinks about is getting to heaven, and God says, you could have had this and this and this, but you didn't ask for it. And so I make sure that I always pray and pray and pray and ask for everything I can. And then, which is so funny. Now I'm realizing like how similar that scene is to like Satan tempting Jesus, of like, you can have all of this. I never made that connection until right now.
I think this is a good opportunity to play this button.
Heresy! Remove this filth!
There you go. Thank you. I needed the more sound effects. For a long time, prayer was just about petitioning, asking and asking and asking. And then I started, when I was in that program for ministry training years ago, I was experiencing depression, partly because of I was kind of social outcast in that environment. And then I started thinking differently about prayer. We're studying a lot about the Bible and church history in that program. And I started looking into the history of prayer and realizing, oh yeah, there's this deep history of traditional prayers that are written that you recite, which we never had in the church I had. No recited except for Our Father. That was it. And then, but every prayer had to be like, it was pretty much like, if it's real and authentic, then it has to be improvisational prayer. And if you're reading it, then that's not real from your soul, and God won't hear it. And there was kind of that vibe. They wouldn't directly say it, but they would. But then I realized, like, I'm in a season right now where I can't pray because of how deeply depressed I am. But there's this rich tradition of prayers, Catholic prayers, Orthodox prayers, these mystical prayers, and that I could read and still and feel something different. And then I started to notice how many of these prayers weren't asking for anything. It was just about praising God and expressing thanks to God. And then I got really into the prayers of thanks, and even found a deep tradition of Jewish prayers and the blessings. There was a rabbinic teaching that said you should pray 100 blessings a day, 100 prayers of thanks a day. And I got really into that and started literally counting them and looking up like traditional prayers of thanks. Even there's one for going to the bathroom that I started praying, which was just literally thanking God for that the orifices and cavities in your body are working properly. And it's just like expressing thanks for that. And then doing one for washing the hands.
To be honest, that wasn't where I thought you were going to go with that. Like, because where my mind went was like, I know some people who like we could all do with praying before we go into the bathroom after them. To be honest.
Oh, I can't believe that's where you've gone with that, Adam.
Come on, it was right. Like, it was right there. How am I not meant to go for that?
It helps to be more aware of those things. Better than just being on your phone the whole time.
I'd like to be less aware of that kind of thing, frankly. So.
No, that's fair. That's fair too.
I generally, though, like, jokes aside, I found that whole section around that kind of approach to thankfulness really moving. And kind of, we had a conversation about saying grace and stuff around Lent, and then actually and those kind of practices of gratitude and recognizing the grace that is in the world, and the value of those. So yeah, I found it quite a interesting and moving segment of the book actually near the end.
Yeah, that's what helped me, especially during that season of depression, is no longer just asking and asking and asking and feeling like I'm not good enough, and moving toward being more grateful for what I have and this earth that God has given to us, and being able to see it at the smallest, tiniest level of what I can be thankful for, and appreciating that. And that I think what it really did, looking back, is it just enabled me to look outside of myself. Because I think in that season, it was just constantly thinking of me and how I'm perceived and how I feel and feelings about my feelings, and being able to look at like the grass is beautiful, the sky, my friends, the go to the bathroom, all of this around me, it calls my attention outward and helps me to not think of myself so much. And so I think that's why it really helped me at the time. And then there's all these different therapeutic techniques these days that are about like name the 5 things in the room around you when you're feeling anxious, or notice your senses, things like that. And I think it's like there are just all these different ways to come about just calling your attention outward when you're too inward. And so it's interesting. Like there's all kinds of ways you could get to that point, and the way I did was through prayer and history of traditional prayers.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And yeah, there's loads to unpack there and loads of great stuff. But we are coming to the end of our time with you, Damon. So I will finish by once again heartily recommending people go out and find the book. It is out in June. Where is the best place for people to find it?
It's anywhere you buy books. It's also on my website. I'm updating it right now, but DamonGarcia.com. And you can follow me on Instagram /whoisdamon. Also, I'm on YouTube, just my name, Damon Garcia. And that's the main places I'm posting right now. And then, but yeah, literally anywhere that sells books, you can call your local bookshop, get them to pre-order it for you, and they'll get it. But it comes out June 23rd, and I'm excited for everybody to read it.
I've discovered that I can just Instagram the local independent bookshop near me and just ask them to order books for me, which is both a fantastic and worrying opportunity that I have to just message and be like, hey, can you get this book for me? Thanks. And then pop over and get it, which is really cool. Like, I really appreciate it, but also too easy, dangerously easy to just get them to buy me books.
I guess the key is to, like, maybe we'll message loads of bookshops and just they'll all get them in, and we don't turn up, and then someone else will have to buy them.
Smart. Yeah. Good plan. Cool. Thank you very much, Damon. And we highly recommend going and seeking out your stuff for listeners. It is even outside of both books, which are fantastic. There's loads of great stuff on your YouTube and stuff. Well worth seeking out. Adam, if people want lower quality content, where on earth can they find you?
Bread and Rosaries podcast. I'm on various platforms, TikTok, Blue Sky, that kind of thing, at Commie, XIAN.
Brilliant. All of our contact details and information is on breadandrosaries.com. We love to hear from people. We love if you can get in touch with thoughts, feedback, questions, ideas, all really great to hear from people. So all our contact details are up there. We are on YouTube. Adam would like you to subscribe to us on YouTube if you can. If you want to see our ugly faces, then that is an option. But even if you're only listening on the podcast, you can subscribe to our YouTube as well. Everything else is on the website as you need it. Thank you very much for listening. And thank you, Damon, for joining us this week.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.